We are nearing the end of our exciting day, and soon you'll be able to see the sunshine. Let's give it another hour and a half. Thank you all for coming. Everybody has begun their comments by thanking me. And, I was talking with Sarah at lunch, actually, about how, one of the things about being an administrator is you often get blamed for things that you had nothing to do with. But the flip side of that is you also get thanked for things that you had nothing to do with. So the real thanks here goes to Ryan, to Kelsey, to Mary, to Sherry, to Michael, to the staff for putting this all together, but particularly for Ryan for really putting it all together, and to all of you for coming out to do this. To those of you, particularly who came from abroad, for coming all this way to be with us today, particularly for those of you who come from abroad with administrative positions, thank you for coming. And thank you also to those of you who just came from the next state over. We appreciate that as well. And for all of you who came from your offices, we appreciate that as well, and recognize the difficulty of making that journey. All right, our first speaker today, this afternoon, is Matt Goldish. Professor Goldish is the Samuel and Esther Melton Chair in Jewish History at The Ohio State University, a specialist on the medieval and early modern period and on Messianism and Jewish-Christian relations and, of course, Sephardic studies. He is the author of, among others, Judaism in the Theology of Sir Isaac Newton, the Sabbatean Prophets, and Jewish Questions, Responsa on Jewish Life in the Early Modern Period. And he will be speaking this afternoon on some aspects of Sephardi identity. Oh, that'll be interesting. Some aspects of Sephardi identity reflected in Post-Expulsion Rabbinic Responsa. So, Matt Goldish.
Well, I'd like to thank Jeff. Yes, thanks to Ryan, thank you to Jeff, thank you to Kelsey, thank you to the Frankel family. The way that I look at this in a conference is that like the teacher in Fast Times at Ridgemont High who says, "This is my piece of time, I own this time. I hope you will excuse me because I may or may not get to my paper, could be halfway through. What I want to spend my time on at the beginning, for however long it takes, is saying a couple of things about the conference and about some of the discussions. I find the whole sincere discussion about whether Sephardi identity or a Sephardi diaspora ever existed to be honestly patently absurd. I think now, I as I say this, I have to recognize that I'm sure every one of the fellows and the people here, I've learned immense amounts from so many of my colleagues here. Basically, katonti, stafila. The scholars here who have spoken tower over me, and many of you are people whose books I not only read but sometimes assign to classes, so I really have no excuse for what I'm about to do. But the papers up until this point have been at such a high level, so fine-grained and detailed, and the work at such a high level. I feel bad breaking the streak, but here we go. I really do not understand the discussion about whether Sephardi identity or a Sephardi diaspora ever existed. I don't understand it. I think my own little bits of evidence about this are pretty pedestrian in the paper that I thought I was giving today. So I'm going to put off discussing those for a little bit. This approach seems to me to be part of a sort of postmodern, post-colonial project of deconstruction, a sort of academic trend. The kind of discussion which occurred yesterday in Miriam's paper, and please allow me to say Miriam is one of my favorite people, one of the great scholars. I think that my classes at The Ohio State University, which is arguably the biggest university in the country, have probably accounted for half the sales of her book on Amsterdam. So I just want to say, I'm saying this in total respect, but
I have pocketed only a tiny fraction.
yes. I'm somewhat familiar with how that works, and that, the $1.50 that you have made, I want to, my classes read your books. The kind of discussion which occurred yesterday in Miriam's paper and the discussion afterwards could be fashioned for any community or culture group to show it doesn't really exist. I guess this applies quite a bit to Jonathan's book also, so some of what I have to say has to do with your book too. It's going to be really fun having you speak after me. If you're looking for differences, and that is your focus, differences between linguistic differences, cultural differences, and that's your focus, you're going to find them. And then you'll come up with a story like we heard from Miriam yesterday. And yet, if Miriam or Jonathan were challenged to present a story of what brings Sephardim together, what creates a Sephardic culture, if that were the project, if that were the goal, what makes Sephardim a group, I have not the slightest doubt that you could have done that. Everything, absolutely everything, is a cultural construct. What else could it be? I think the term is meaningless. So if we talk about Sephardim, Sephardi culture, a Sephardi diaspora as a cultural construct, yeah, okay, of course it is. In terms of our issue, unless you're a diehard Aristotelian, you would assume that we begin with a blank slate. It's not as if somebody pops out of their mother and says, "I'm a Sephardi," right? It's all learned. It's all part of the brainwashing that our parents do to all of us, which is what we do as we're growing up. So everything is shaped by society and human interaction. Why would something called Sephardi identity be any different than anything else in that sense? I want to say that identity, if you have kids, or if you were a kid, which I know many of you were, you are familiar with a toy. It's a little pole that has these round rings that go on it, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? And the little kid, places them in order. Our identities are put together from lots of different pieces, and I wouldn't expect the piece that's the Sephardi piece of a Sephardi's identity to necessarily be the big red ring on the bottom. It's not necessarily going to be the biggest piece. It's going to be a piece. So if you're looking for it to be the outstanding piece, the most noticeable piece, the most important piece, well, good luck. It's not going to happen. We have to take into account that in any person's identity, in any Sephardi person's identity, that is going to be one of those pieces, and it might be the little tiny yellow one at the top. Okay. I strongly agree with two things Miriam said yesterday, and I disagree with a lot of the rest. She is certainly correct that people come together and split apart. You sort of said this toward the end of your talk, that people come together and split apart. They rearrange all the time. So we have to be careful about how we group them. I thought that was very important. And I also strongly agreed with the point that the search for identity, something called identity, is a very late 20th, early 21st century type of project, that You put it beautifully. I'm not sure that I can reconstruct it, but I think you said that the people that we're studying didn't have thoughts about identity. I think you said that they were highly transactional. Was that the term? What I understood you to be saying is that the people we're dealing with, like pretty much everybody, before the search for identity, people were trying to put together the pieces of their lives to make life work for them, to be able to live and prosper, and that was what they were doing with whatever life offered them, including the pieces of what we like to now refer to as identity. We'll never succeed in trying to identify something as a common culture, especially in a diaspora, by looking for the complete set, the shared language, the geography, the period, the economic interests, the networks, the foodways, the religious practices, the philosophy, the literature, everything in common at the same time. If we think that that's all going to come together in a clear way, we're not going to find it, in my opinion. This kind of sharply defined common culture, it's very rare. If it ever happens, the lines will always be fuzzy. There will always be multiple factors. I might point to the discussion over the last year or two in this country about what it means to be black. If you recall that discussion, it's the same kind of problem, right? Where are you going to find the essential, right? What is the key that actually makes somebody belong or not belong to that group? The lines will always be fuzzy. Multiple factors will divide any group's culture as well as bringing it together. The group may be joined at one point more by language and foodways, at another time more by literature and religious practice, and so on. And I think that the key is to maintain a flexible view of what it is that we're looking for that holds the group together. My late teacher, Amos Funkenstein, used to point out that you can't speak of Jews as a people over hundreds or thousands of years if your standard for peoplehood remains too static. Now, I know that there are people who will say, well, yes, that's correct. There is not a people called the Jews, and so on. Okay. I kept hearing people yesterday saying, well, aside from the cultural elite, there's no common whatever, right? Aside from the cultural elite. Well, if you're looking for popular culture, you'll find the same thing that Peter Burke found when he wrote about popular culture. It is an elusive quarry. Maybe it's ironic that the place that you might look for the material is in the Responsa, my favorite genre. But it's pretty limited, right? Material from the archives, from the inquisitorial archives and so on, there's a certain amount, highly unreliable in many ways, whatever you think of Netanyahu, but there's some of that, but it's very hard to get at that. So let's go ahead and admit that whatever evidence we're going to find is mainly going to come from the cultural elite, in the case of Sephardim, especially from rabbis, authors, poets, political leaders, and often those are the same people in the medieval and early modern context. In that vein, it's not clear to me why nobody wants to talk seriously about religious practice and prayer style, nusach, as extremely important markers of common culture. The fact that these are not important parts of people's culture today may be misleading us about their centrality in the medieval and early modern world. Here, there is an extremely clear sense of Sephardim as a group. Back in the Iberian Peninsula, every city and major town had its own nusach, its own melodies, its own special practices. Will that lead us to think that there is no common Sephardi ritual? That would be absurd. Those nuschaot, melodies, practices, have a great deal in common, and they easily mark Sephardim as different from Persian Jews, Yemenite Jews, Italiani, Germans, Poles, etc. The rabbis in the generation of the expulsion already speak of a common Sephardi nusach, as we might see if I ever actually manage to get to my paper. And of course, Jonathan is right. in what he says in his book, that it is after the expulsion that people's Sephardi identity kind of becomes not only homogenized, but becomes more noticeable. That would be the way it would work. If you would take, Sean Hannity and Elizabeth Warren, right, and drop them together on an island in Fiji, they would suddenly discover, right, it might take them a few days, they might have to talk for a while and beat each other up, but eventually they might notice that what brings them together, their Americanness, right, might be, there might be much more there than they realized. They might have a lot more in common than they thought before they went there. It is the experience of being on the island and as the only two Americans there that might actually make them notice that. But of course, we realize that those things that they notice bring them together when they're on the island were all there when they were in America also, when they were in the United States. They just didn't notice them because they were busy just being themselves. Again, right, if you would take a Southerner, a New Yorker, and somebody who speaks like proper English, like me, because I'm from Long Beach, California. We speak properly, right? And you would drop them all on an island. Their children would all probably speak the same kind of English, even though they speak very different English. You follow the point. I will not keep on that. It was only in the largest communities like Saloniki or Kushta where every individual Iberian city and town could maintain its own kihila. And for that matter, because of the Sugun and other migrations occurring at the same time, Saloniki also had multiple Italian kihilot, Ashkenazim, Romaniots, and so on. In the 16th century, there were 4 or 5 dozen separate kihilot in Saloniki. That should not detract from our understanding that there was an extremely close family resemblance between the nuschaot and the traditions of the Iberian kihilot, which was noticeably different from those of other communities coming from elsewhere. While migration certainly contributed to the homogenization of formerly diverse Iberian nuschaot and ritual practices, that tendency probably would have moved forward in any case, especially as a result of the printing press. You couldn't commit to a run of 34 copies of the Nusach Teruel or the Nusach Badahoz prayer book. The printers would produce large runs of the liturgy of the largest communities, and the others would slowly fade, and that actually still happens today. So a very large city, a city with a lot of Jews, might have separate kihilot for every type of Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Italian, Romaniot. But small towns, as you will see in my evidence if I ever do get to my paper, tended to have 1 kihila or 2 kihilot, and people who came from all these different towns weren't going to be able to keep up their nusach the way that they did it back in Spain or Portugal anyway. Miriam stated yesterday that H.J. Zimmel's idea about the harmonization of legal practice as a result of the printing of the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century with the glosses of the Ramah is something nobody would say today. First of all, I think that many people still think that that is true, at least to a large degree. I think Elchanan Reiner has been writing about the way that this worked with the Shulchan Aruch. Second of all, who can doubt that works like Maimonides' Yad, Jacob ben Asher's Tur, or Joseph Caro's Shulchan Aruch did indeed help homogenize communal practices. Not only was that part of the purpose, it is precisely the reason that these codes were controversial. Right? It was one thing when the local Rav made all the halachic decisions. The local Rav got very angry when a book came out telling everybody what to do in halacha, And that Rav is no longer the great authority. Then again, the differences in practice, which those codes tended to bulldoze, would usually look absolutely trivial to most modern readers anyway. Sephardi practice was quite uniform in all its general contours, and it's part of what made Sephardim, both before and after the expulsion, a recognizable cultural group. Again, I've got little bits of evidence if I ever get to it. Ross yesterday offered a much-needed corrective about the genuine existence of a Sephardi literary style. I'm probably not using the right term for what you described, but much vaunted and marketed over 250 years, which created a standard of Sephardi thought or culture. And while I wasn't so excited about the description of this enterprise as in these very commercial terms, that they sold it and that they convinced people, that's another sphere in which a common Sephardi heritage seems, at least to a dinosaur positivist like me, to be a genuine thing. In terms of the post-expulsion period, communal leaders in the Iberian Peninsula had spoken of Sepharad and Sephardi practices for centuries without need of further elaboration for their readers or audiences. And Jonathan, at the beginning of chapter 7 of your book, you say this funny thing about that in the Ottoman Empire they trotted out that old rabbinic term Sephardim, right? First of all, I've got it with me. I'll show you.
I'm sure you're right.
You're not even my age. You should be remembering stuff like this. It's first of all, I don't know how you would go about showing that other people weren't using that term commonly. The written records we have that would be in a context to use the term were essentially rabbinic records. But why would it be only a rabbinic term? Why is it sort of this old term that was trotted out to create a new identity? I don't buy it without further evidence. So the idea of a common Sephardi practice and the idea of Sephardim had been around for hundreds of years, as I hope to show in a little while, maybe. I disagree with Miriam that it was usually nothing more than a geographic marker to say Sepharad or Sephardi, and again, I'll try and show a little evidence about that. It certainly was a geographic marker, but I think it was much more than that. In context, the terms clearly mean much more than that. Sepharad in rabbinic discourse, and again, I want to say rabbis are people too. I once at an AJS conference said that I think that Spinoza is as much of a Sephardi as the guy with a turban smoking a hookah and selling opium or whatever. And people yelled at me that it wasn't true. Well, rabbis from Sepharad are Sephardim too, and rabbinic culture and religious culture is part of Sephardic culture also. Perhaps I've said something along those lines in the last 3 minutes already. The terms clearly mean much more than just a geographical location. In rabbinic discourse, Sepharad is a commonly understood cultural zone which had geographical dimensions apparently understood by all. It has common religious practices with regional variations, and most of all, the people who live there or come from there recognize each other as part of a common community. Yes, of course, there are regional variations and tensions. That's true of every sizable community, of any community group. With Litvaks and Galicianers, the Polish Galicianers, not the people of the other Galicia, would Litvaks and Galicianers not recognize each other as part of a common portion of the Jewish people despite their differences and their animosity. I'm sorry to bring an example from the Ashkenazi world, but these people certainly back where they were, in Europe, probably very seldom described themselves as Ashkenazim, but when they were living on the Lower East Side of New York or something, suddenly, right, like Hannity and Warren on the island in Fiji, right, suddenly things look different, and they recognize that they can talk to each other in Yiddish and so on. Okay, regarding the Mediterranean diaspora of Sephardim, I would not dare take my version of the story beyond the middle of the 18th century. Everything after that, for me, is really not so much history as journalism, but okay. Though many people in the story of Sephardi identity actually, for many people, the story of Sephardi identity actually picks up with the publication of the Me'am Lo'ez, for example. I'm not one of those people. If you have communities of people all over the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and parts of Italy, okay, this is the core of my case. You have communities of people all over the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, parts of Italy, who were expelled together at the same time by the decree of the same two monarchs, expelled from a tightly defined geographical area ruled by those monarchs. They speak similar languages, and God help me for those people who are the language experts. I apologize, but for me, the real question is, can they understand each other? Can they talk to each other, right? That's going to be the question, and they can, right? They can understand each other, so they speak related languages. They can speak to each other. They have similar religious practices. They have similar food ways. They have similar music. They have similar prayer styles. I do not say identical. I say similar, related. Is it so far-fetched, considering all of that, to imagine that even immediately after the expulsion, even not deep into the 16th century, but even shortly after the expulsion, and maybe even before the expulsion, for those relevant factors, they saw themselves as part of a group. Add to that the fact that their authors, leaders, and observers commonly referred to them by the common appellation of Sephardim, as they had back in Sepharad for centuries, and one must wonder quite what the great puzzle is. It's natural that over time some of these people lost their attachment to the Iberian languages while others held on. The languages themselves became changed and homogenized. It seems noteworthy to me that throughout the early modern period, travelers could go from Marrakesh to Amsterdam, from Venice to Nicopolis, and for that matter, from London to Suriname, and communicate with their fellow Sephardim, which is a term I'm willing to use, in some version of Jewish Spanish. Levantine Sephardim, such as Chaim Isaac Karigal or the Chida, and here I am going over my limits into the later 18th century, while their Arabic undoubtedly came in handy during their travels, they certainly gave their sermons in the communities they visited in Castilian of some kind, some form of Spanish, almost everywhere they went. Now to the Western Sephardi diaspora. I will happily argue that it is indeed part of the Sephardi diaspora. I'm going out on a limb here, not only with Miriam in the room, but my own teacher, Yosef Kaplan, is the one who I think helped popularize the very concept of a Western Sephardi diaspora. I'm perhaps moving backwards and saying that I think it really is part of the Sephardi diaspora. The group is significantly different than the Eastern or Ottoman Sephardic diaspora, but at the risk of arguing with Miriam, who is the expert, I am going to plunge forward and challenge some of those claims. The Western Sephardim were never entirely cut off from the Ottoman, African, and Italian Sephardim. While they looked down on those Levantines, and we know that they did, there was a constant flow of people moving, and we've even heard about some of them here at the conference. People moving back and forth between Morocco, Saloniki, Kushta, Palestine, Spain, France, Amsterdam, Venice, and London. People are constantly moving around. In fact, they're being shoveled out of Amsterdam to go to these other locations if they come in to beg, right? They come in poor and they're sent on their way, despachados. right? And maybe half the time they go wherever they've been sent, and then they come back again. I'm not in a position to try and present some kind of list, but teachers, scholars, merchants, agents, printers, typesetters, artists, beggars, all moving back and forth freely between these places. Miriam mentioned that the Western Sephardim for the first several generations brought Levantine rabbis to lead them. These were people of considerable influence, and they're rabbis, so that the Nusach HaTefilah that they are teaching in the Western Sephardi diaspora is a Sephardic Nusach. That is part of their culture. If you would put an Amsterdam Portuguese merchant next to an Ashkenazi, an Italian Jew, and a Levantino, for example, and ask them who is similar to you, well, they would first say, none of them, I'm nothing like any of these people, but culturally, in terms of their religious practices and so on, it's clear that they are Sephardim. I am fairly certain that some, though perhaps not all, of these Chachamim who were brought in gave their sermons in Spanish rather than Portuguese. I don't actually know. Mortera, who was an Ashkenazi, spoke in Portuguese, but he came as a kid. The communities did indeed stress the concept of nation, but not to the total exclusion of any wider Sephardi identity, I think. Many called their co-religionists, many called their congregations, right, depending on where you go, it was often the Spanish and Portuguese congregation. And also, as we know, without getting into some of the other things people have said, but there was a significant movement of Portuguese Jews from Portugal back into Spain to get away from the Portuguese Inquisition in certain periods. So the Spanish and Portuguese distinction weakens there. Indeed, Spanish was always a literary language in those communities. If we peek in at the library of the Amsterdam Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, or the communal collection that's now at the Rosenthaliana, we'll see that works of the Sephardi rabbinic scholars from all over are on those shelves. At any given time, there were Levantine Sephardim in Amsterdam bringing their Hebrew books to press, collecting for the poor of the Holy Land, trading or begging. Again, if we look at the religious culture, it is abundantly clear that the Western Sephardim are indeed Sephardim. Their prayer style, their legal decisions, most of their traditional practices were imported from the Ottoman and Italian Sephardic Jews. It is, as always, possible to find subtle differences, and we are well aware of the feelings of superiority among Western Sephardim, but I believe that there's more than ample evidence that linguistically, religiously, economically, there is some alignment between the Western and Eastern Sephardi diasporas that we can make a case for. Okay, I think I'm done with my screed, and I am now going to talk. How long do I have?
Less than 5 minutes.
Less than 5 minutes. I'm going to spend 5 minutes on Responsa. Here, can you pass those out? Nobody else got clocked like that. My gosh, it always happens to me. Okay. So this is a very, very rough document. This is the first time that I have ever used the Bar Ilan Responsa database. I've written a lot about Responsa before. I've never used the database before. It's a little intoxicating, and what I came out with was a big mess. I also want to ask you to forgive me for giving you translations instead of original texts. I had trouble copying and pasting the Hebrew texts. So the first thing that I want to point out here is, so I go back from the She'elot Tshuvot of the Rambam forward to the Rashdam, who was born in 1505. In the earlier rabbis who were living in Spain, they have very little to say about Sephardim, about being a Sephardi, about Sepharad. Right, just a few mentions in each one. Why? because for the same reason that you and I don't spend a lot of time thinking or writing or talking about being Americans. If you're the President of the United States, you address everybody as my fellow Americans because, right, that's important to make mention of that. But for most of us, it's not an important point as long as we're here. It's not until we leave that we start thinking about what brought us together as Americans, or in this case, that made Sephardim talk about being a Sephardi. So if you look in the Rambam, the Rashba, Ritva, only a few mentions of the concept of Sepharad and Sephardim, whereas when you get to Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Avkat Rochel, which is a fairly short collection, of Responsa, or when you get to the Rashdam, at which point I had run out of steam and didn't break it out for you, but 26 mentions of Sepharad and a separate 5 additional mentions of Sephardim. Obviously, as a topic or as a term, it becomes much more relevant and important and used when people have left Sepharad. On this point, I agree with Jonathan. That is the first point. The second point is that you'll notice that although Sepharad is used throughout as a geographical term, it certainly is that, and maybe predominantly that, but in many of these documents, there is a subtlety about its use, that it means more than simply a geographical location. It means a place of a common religious practice, of common identity. There are the scholars of Sepharad, there are the practices of Sepharad, and so on. Because I clearly don't have time to sort of go through these and point out some of the subtleties that you can spot here, I will just leave you to do that by yourselves now that I've given you the documents. And thank you for your patience with me, and prepare myself to be attacked. Okay.
Well, now I don't know what to believe. Our next speaker, to perhaps contradict the previous speaker, is Jonathan Ray, who is professor of Jewish Studies and Samuel Eig. Is that Samuel Eig Professor of Theology? Is it, or of Religious Studies? Of Jewish Studies in the Theology Department at Georgetown University. He's the author of The Sephardic Frontier, The Reconquista and the Jewish Community in Medieval Iberia, and of After Expulsion, 1492, and the Making of Sephardic Jewry. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Ray.
So, hang in there, folks. We're almost finished. In accordance with local custom, I want to begin by thanking Jeff, the Frankel Center, Kelsey, Ryan, everyone involved, and really the fellows for allowing me to join in what seems to have been a long time of stimulation and fun that I'm just sort of getting the actual very end of. But with Custom, we have innovation. I also want to thank another person. I want to thank Matt. I was really worried that my stuff was not going to hold up and I was going to get pilloried, but I kind of feel like a little of the pressure is off now. Matt went out there and let his flag fly, so it should be an interesting question and answer session afterwards. I really don't have the sort of granular and excellent talks that I've heard that have really stimulated me. Part of the problem about going last is that some of the stuff that I thought was insightful has already been said better than I could say it, and then a lot of the stuff that I thought was insightful I realized I had to revise because I'm learning as I go along. But for what it's worth, I did want to offer some ways of possibly thinking of this question of identity, at least how I understand it. I think now the question of what is identity versus what is culture might be different. We might be talking about the same thing, we might not, and that might come out in the Q&A afterwards. The rise and fall of Iberian Jewry represents one of the most celebrated chapters in the long history of the Jewish people. Already in the High Middle Ages, as we know, its native sons boasted about its unrivaled cultural prominence and almost simultaneously began to mourn its decline. Such dramatic claims helped to cast a mythic light on medieval Sepharad, converting it into a lieu de mémoire even before the expulsion of 1492. The power of the so-called Sephardic mystique is such that it has often clouded more precise discussions about its extent and meaning within Hispano-Jewish society during that formative medieval period. Many of us have now recognized that the Sephardic so-called Golden Age is more image than historical reality, albeit a powerful and enduring image, as we have seen, I think, throughout our careers. But what exactly was the social reality? Did the Jews of the medieval Iberian Peninsula represent a single shared cultural community? And if so, did they really see that that community was an exceptional subset of a larger Jewish diaspora? That is to say, was there a Sephardic consciousness in the Middle Ages? And if so, to what extent was it embraced by the Jews of all of medieval Iberia? While the full answer to that question lies beyond my allotted time here, I would like to address a few key aspects of the socio-historical dimension of this question, with a particular focus on what the internal makeup of that society can teach us, or perhaps suggest to us, about the nature and limits of Sephardic identity. This conference takes as its point of departure a fairly well-known assertion about pre-modern Sephardic identity, namely, and I'm quoting whoever wrote the brochure for this, before the contemporary period, Jews of Sepharad, that is to say Iberia, were regularly depicted and regularly depicted themselves as part of a unique and exclusive group, more distinguished than other groups, than the groups of other lands. I'm, for one, going to accept that, at the very least, a discourse on Sephardi identity did exist in the medieval period. And for me, then, the question then becomes about the limits of that discourse, as well as how that discourse functioned within the community, and perhaps why it functioned in the way it did. Did all Iberian Jews assume a posture of cultural superiority, or was it more of a just geographical sense of where they were? And if not, how might they have experienced Sephardic or Andalusi or Hispano-Jewish identity? I would suggest that much like other national identities and the various claims and characterizations that go with them, the notion of Sephardic superiority existed as a medieval literary trope, which is then revived by modern intellectuals and politicians to meet certain ends, who are then projecting this notion again back onto a broader group in the Middle Ages. And finally, by academics like ourselves, who create and make sense of our fields using these terms. This is something Miriam suggested the other day. I'm also thinking here less of Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities than of Patrick Geary's Myth of Nations, which deals, I think, more directly with the medieval period. In light of this observation, it's worthwhile to consider the extent to which the mythos of Sephardic exclusivity was embraced by the medieval Sephardim themselves. First, to the degree that Sephardic authors did engage in touting the unique characteristics of the group and lineage, and I think many did, it should be noted that such posturing was not unique for the era. Indeed, boasting of ethnic or tribal superiority was common to a variety of nations throughout the Middle Ages. In the Jewish world in particular, claims of communal superiority were made in different ways and for different reasons by Rabbinites, Karaites, Ashkenazim, Romaniotes, all on the basis of lineage or piety or intellectual prowess, etc. Secondly, it is highly unlikely that those intellectuals who wrote about Sephardic exclusivity did so on behalf of the rank and file of their local kehilot. On the contrary, superiority of lineage was at times used to explain why these average Jews should recognize the leadership of certain clans over other clans who might claim authority over that same kehillah. It is perhaps helpful for us to reflect upon the basic sociopolitical structure of Iberian Jewry. So I'll look first at a little bit of Jewish life under Muslim rule and then move to Jewish life under Christian rule. Medieval Jewish society was geographically fragmented into regional and local communities that were, in turn, highly ramified. The Jewish communities in medieval Iberia were no different in this regard. Indeed, any serious attempt at reconstructing medieval Sephardi identity must begin with the recognition that the society with which this identity is often associated did not exist as a cohesive whole. And here I take issue with some other structures of medieval Jewish society. To be sure, as early as the 10th century, groups of Jewish elites had become engaged in the intellectual and political world of Al-Andalus and began to echo some of the nativist sentiments of their local Muslim counterparts. But this process was no doubt slow and, when one considers the whole of Andalusi Jewish society, uneven. It is highly unlikely that the local Jews who had already accommodated to Roman and Visigothic culture abandoned it overnight and en masse. Rather, it is far more likely, and I'm saying likely because our knowledge from the early centuries of medieval Sepharad is fairly dark, but it's far more likely that there existed substantial conflicts between these native Jews and the new arrivals from Arabic-speaking lands who came to the region over the course of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. Echoes of these encounters were preserved by Ibn Daud in his well-known story of the four captives, and in the intellectual debates between native grammarian Ibn Saruk and newcomer Ibn Labrat. Thus, we should not imagine that centuries of immigration from around the Jewish world would have resulted in the seamless and immediate amalgamation of Jews into a unified Sephardi community with a shared identity and cultural outlook. When considering that the evolution of a common culture or identity of early Sephardic society and whether it existed at all, we might imagine long periods of tense coexistence between Jews with differing customs and cultural allegiances, as was the case in other places in the medieval world, as was the case in American immigrant history, in the history of Jewish accommodation to the state of Israel in the 20th and 21st century, etc. In addition to a shared sense of ethno-regional superiority, this protracted process of cultural destabilization and integration also fostered an atmosphere of intellectual and political competition within Jewish society as various groups of elites sought to defend and promote their own authority with regard to Jewish customs, laws, and communal governance. I think here not just of the more famous aspect of the story of the four captives, the bit that comes afterwards, where the local Ibn Fallija clan essentially subsumes the Hanok clan within it, and have to read that as something that Ibn Daud is writing for his contemporaries in Toledo long after the fact. Such internal competition remained a defining characteristic of Iberian Jewish community into the Middle Ages. By the 13th century, when the majority of Andalusi Jewry had resettled in Christian Iberia and Provence, they came into more regular contact with the scholarly traditions of Northern Europe, as is well known, including the trends of deep and abstract interpretation of Talmudic literature, then popular among the French Tosafot and their disciples. It was in the face of these new intellectual traditions that some Sephardic scholars sought to reassert their native customs with regard to the study of rabbinic texts. Judah ibn Abbas, author of a 13th century work, Yer Nativ, emphasized that the study of the Tosafot and their commentaries on the Talmud was a waste of time, since the sole purpose of the Talmud was a source for applied law, saying that this is the way we do things in Sepharad. Such attacks on outside trends should not be taken purely as evidence of a Sephardic cultural norm, per se. Rather, they can also be seen as an extension of a long-standing and almost universal Jewish rejection of any intellectual or religious tradition that was foreign to one's own scholarly circle. Thus, defense of a Sephardic, quote, Sephardic practice in this regard should not be read as a representative of attitudes of a broad cultural community, but an assertion on behalf of self-deputized representatives of that community who sought to promote certain intellectual customs and norms over those of other groups. The trait being reflected here is as much the internal competition and maneuvering among Jewish intellectuals as the articulation of a shared cultural ethos, or perhaps the right to articulate or control one's own take on that ethos. Our difficulty at times in seeing the trees for the forest has continued despite a growing literature on Sephardic history that has added a great deal of nuance and insight into our understanding of the field. This disconnect is particularly notable in the American Academy, where the historiographic tradition has an interest in the outstanding figures of the so-called Golden Age, and has tended to overshadow some of the internal composition of medieval Sephardic communities. I, for one, who do not work on these, will say this is, as an aside, completely understandable. It is hard not to read this poetry, the halakha, the great works of the great men, and not be taken with them. But as a social historian, I see there is a way to bring up a sense of balance, especially for periods after the late 12th century, where we do have some more, in this sense, archival information, not just rabbinic information. And I'm not talking about inquisitorial, I'm talking real archival information before the Inquisition to balance that portrait. While the presence of a number of great influential men among the Jews in medieval Iberia is undeniable, and the degree to which that they took this characteristic of the age to be their own is something that we still have to question. One can argue that our admiration for Ibn Nagrela as vizier and general of a Muslim army is based in large part on the fact that it was not the norm. If everyone was the vizier or general of a Muslim army, he wouldn't be quite as famous. Similarly, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, while no doubt a seminal figure in Jewish history, did not function as head of the Jews in any regionally recognized way. Although he worked on behalf of some of his fellow Jews and was a major patron of Jewish religious and intellectual life, most Andalusi Jews outside of Cordoba would not have recognized him as their leader in any official religious or political capacity. Rather, he was a prominent Jew who had an elevated position in the Muslim government of Cordoba, a fact that did not alter the fundamentally decentralized nature of Jewish communal government at that time. Moreover, such powerful Jewish notables were the exception, not the rule, of how Hispano-Jewish society was organized for most of the medieval period. We know of no such Ibn Shapruts or other Jewish figures in Andalusi cities such as Jaén, Denia, Malaga, Tortosa, Mérida for the Andalusi period. And the titles that were held by those few, such as Nasir Nagid, and the activities they performed as courtiers, Maya, that I was using the word courtiers, you can correct me on that, they appear to represent a sui generis position that's not indicative of regular or continuing institutions. In late medieval Castile and Portugal, some Jews partnered with the crown to establish formal positions of a Jewish headman or chief rabbi, often called Arabi or Rab Mayor, but that particular office never became as universal or as permanent as it might have, and ultimately fell short of a communal institution that could really shape and represent a more unified Sephardic entity. Indeed, it is hard to speak of a regional Jewish center in either Muslim or Christian Spain during the Middle Ages, despite the continued use of that term. Certain intellectual circles, such as those in Cordoba, Lucena, or Granada, celebrated their independence from the Geonim of Baghdad before the close of the 12th century. But this does not mean that there was a unified Jewish society where Jews in Tortosa or Almeria would turn to Cordoba for answers because they were part of an Andalusi cultural community that had gained independence as one from Baghdadi Jewish leadership. Sitting in Al-Andalus in the 11th or 12th centuries, around the time that Moses ibn Ezra or Abraham ibn Daud were extolling the virtues of the exile of Jerusalem who were in Sepharad, most Jews would not have acknowledged the great Sephardic literati or political grandees of their day as their cultural or political leaders, nor would they have understood themselves as participating in a special cultural milieu, and I would say and vice versa. I don't think when these people are extolling the wonders of Sepharad, they're thinking about Moshe the scrap iron dealer, or whoever Mark was, scrap metal or scrap iron, I don't know what Mark was mentioning in Valencia earlier. The same lack of communal unification and cooperation can be seen in regard to the Sephardic commercial activity of the day. It is similarly difficult to speak of the Sephardic traders as a group, even in the heyday of Jewish involvement in long-distance trade. In her recent study on the Geniza merchants, Jessica Goldberg writes that, quote, writes about what I would quote as individual geographies of trade rather than national or regional groups. The suggestion here is that we should not think of medieval Sephardim collectively as traders, at least not regard to the Geniza period. Rather, we should imagine a world in which the small bands of Sephardi Jews were part of some Mediterranean mercantile networks, but not others, and where the groups involved in long-distance trade shifted over time. Moreover, Mediterranean trade seems to have accounted for a fairly small portion of the medieval Sephardic economy, a fact that raises a few questions. The first is that the mercantile activity of Iberian Jews was part of a diverse local economy that was much more characterized by petty agriculture and artisanry as it was of great merchant houses. Despite the sustained fascination with the Geniza merchants as representatives of medieval Jewish society writ large, the fact is that most medieval Sephardim lived on the margins of the Mediterranean trade networks as local small-scale farmers, shop owners, peddlers, and pawnbrokers. This underscores a reality that most Jews were not connected to these trade routes and nonetheless shared local communities and neighborhoods with some Jews who were. Thus, a second point about Andalusian merchants that we might consider at this point is what it means to be part of this ramified society in which connections to people outside society simultaneously distance those merchants from others within their home communities, in means of identity at least. This social reality is a key factor in understanding the internal character of these local Sephardic kehilot in the Middle Ages. If, as is often noted, establishing bonds of mutual trust was the foundational social component in medieval trade networks, then exclusion from such relationships was also significant. In other words, we must pause to consider the importance of relationships between Jews of the same local community where mutual trust did not exist or was not fostered by common economic or social interests. To be sure, a certain amount of shared interest always existed within the Kehillah with regard to communal taxes, and fate in times of political upheaval, etc., etc. Yet those common bonds could easily be tested when they conflicted with the ties that Jews had to Jews outside the community and to non-Jews outside the community as well. In such instances, how did Jews prioritize relationships? Involvement in trade networks, intellectual circles, and services to non-Jewish lords bound a segment of medieval Jewish populations beyond their local kahal, while distancing them from others within it. This is something I talked a little bit about in my last book, which is interesting that one of the questions of do you stay or do you go is, well, who is going to help you actually make that journey? And all of a sudden we have people who have trade connections in North Africa having more options than beggars in their local Jewish community who don't have such connections. The resulting tensions with regard to loyalties and mutual responsibility should not be overlooked, especially in smaller medieval communities where such tensions would have been magnified. Competing intellectual factions and had a comparable social impact within Sephardic communities. As with Jewish trade, the world of Jewish scholarship also built upon a series of personal networks of masters and students, echoing practices that were typical throughout the medieval Mediterranean world. These networks extended back in time as rabbis built intellectual genealogies that connected themselves to other scholars and other ideas. While much of the recent scholarship on pre-modern networks has tended to focus on their function as bridges between cultural and religious communities, Jewish networks of communication also played an important role in shaping the internal structures within medieval Jewish society. It was through association with these scholars, living and dead, that Jews were able to enhance their own honor, piety, and status within the world of the Jewish elites. Likewise, the defense of one's master was simultaneously a defense of one's own status. Viewed in this way, the impassioned and protracted battles between the disciples of rival grammarians and others, and the lavish and haughty praise they would give for their heroes, can be understood as a nearly universal medieval Mediterranean form of projecting personal honor rather than just an example of Sephardi mentalite. Nor did these divisions fade over time. On the contrary, by the later Middle Ages, the rough social divisions of many Iberian alhamas had given rise to a rather formal set of ranks, known as classes, orders, or in the Spanish literature, manos. These were in regular conflict with one another over a number of social and political issues. Some documents from the period mention the existence of an upper and lower order, that is a mano mayor or a mano menor, in certain Jewish alhamas, while others talk about a third or middle group, the mano mediana. The chronically destitute and even the bulk of the poorer artisans and petty merchants made up the mano menor and had little hope of improving their status or upward mobility out of it, and they remained economically and politically dependent on those of higher orders in the same alhama. The latter regularly used Jewish law as well as their connection to Jewish and non-Jewish authorities in order to solidify and perpetuate their own standing within the home communities. Such assertions of privilege and authority served to distance them within their own local kehilot, from their neighbors within their own kehilot. Such the portrait of Jewish social organization in the communities of Castile and Navarre is considerably cloudier for the late medieval period than much of the Crown of Aragon, Yet here too, the social dynamic of the Alhamas appears to have revolved around the tensions and struggles between the upper and lower classes, between a small group of wealthy families and the majority of the Jewish populations composed of artisans, merchants, farmers, etc. And here, we might read some of the observations of Abner of Burgos as more than perhaps just polemical flourishes. They might actually be interesting observations about the nature of Jewish communities at that time. And as the social and political situation within Iberian Alhamas became more fraught, declarations of Sephardic identity continued to emerge. In the later Middle Ages, some Jews in the Crown of Aragon linked themselves to a glorious Andalusi past, much in the same way as the Sephardic authors of the 11th and 12th centuries linked to an ancient nobility of Jerusalem. Yet here again, it's important to situate this later trend within the socio-historical context. When Solomon Bonafed and other Jewish poets in 15th century Saragossa sought to demonstrate an ongoing connection between their own writing and the linguistic virtuosity of great Sephardic poets of Al-Andalus, they did so in large part to distinguish themselves from other Jewish elites of their own day. Bonafed could champion poetry as the highest expression of Judaism, as his contemporary Prophet Duran railed against the current focus on Talmud as a betrayal of the true Sephardic intellectual tradition. But it seems clear that these authors were making claims for their particular reading of the Sephardic myth of identity, rather than giving voice to any universal understanding of that identity. That is to say, I think we can recognize that some form of identity existed, but then it plays out in different ways. Thus, Sephardic cultural superiority, when it was imagined and invoked by Aragonese Jews, once again served less as a marker of collective identity than as a means of exclusion and social dominance within the upper echelons of Iberian Jewish society. In Castile, a similar late medieval revival of Sephardic cultural superiority was partially influenced by parallel trends in the surrounding Christian society. And I'm going to pause here to say, it's an interesting point we haven't raised yet. Where are the limits of Sepharad geographically? What does it have to do with limits either of Al-Andalus or of Castile or of Iberia or Hispania geographically as well? It's something at least worth considering. Does the Jewish, at least geographical, if not identitarian map, fall in the same way as the Christian or Muslim one of the day? Is it slightly different? How does it wax and wane over time, etc.? Arguments for the political and cultural superiority of Spain and of Castile in particular became popular among Castilian Christian intellectuals during the 15th century, and Hispano-Jewish writing from this period displays an awareness of such rhetorical trends. Moreover, the conversos of Spain and Portugal continued to be exposed to Christian theories of cultural preeminence, as well as social and even biological purity through the early modern period, as is well known. The cultural outlook developed by leading converso intellectuals who returned to Judaism in the 16th and 17th centuries clearly reveals the influence of contemporary Christian debates over lineage, purity of blood, particularly among the Portuguese Nassau who settled in Northern Europe. Thus, to the extent that we can identify a particularly Sephardic attitude of superiority of lineage during the transition from the medieval to the early modern period, such an attitude appears to be tied up as much with Hispano or Luso-Christian attitudes of the age as any long-standing Hispano-Jewish traditions. During this later period, we also have a hint of the limits of Sephardic identity and exclusivity among the Iberian Jews who resettled in Muslim lands after 1492. For these exiles, the shared cultural heritage of former conversos was not enough to allay the suspicions of religious laxity as the latter attempted to integrate into normative Jewish society. While leading rabbinic authorities debated whether or not the conversos were to be treated as anusim, that is, forced converts and still technically Jews who didn't have to revert to Judaism through any conversion process, many among the rank and file of the Sephardic exiles seemed convinced that those who had lived openly as Christians, regardless of the cause, were indeed Christians and would need a formal and public display of penance in order to be considered Jews again. Here, concern with the common Sephardic cultural or intellectual heritage was no match for a common concern for halakhic observance. The result were petitions for public displays of repentance on the part of these conversos should they want to return to Judaism, provoking a widespread apprehension over the nature of Jewishness among these newcomers. Public doubt over the Jewishness of these refugees can also be seen in the action of the conversos themselves. Many conversos voluntarily took it upon themselves to perform acts of penance as a means of addressing Jewish fears for their impurity and impiety. In the Ottoman city of Safed, new Christian refugees from Portugal were sufficiently cognizant of popular Jewish misgivings with regard to their religious status that they created special organizations aimed at governing repentance as part of a process of re-entry into the Jewish community. Such public acts were a rather striking example of the need to convince other Jews, including other Sephardim and even other ex-conversos, of a shared communal unity, but that identity was Jewish, not Sephardic per se. This information suggests the need for a bit of a recalibration of the nature and internal functioning of medieval Sephardic society, as well as the way in which these social structures shaped and limited communal identity and self-expression. First, our understanding of medieval Sephardic identities must take into consideration the fundamentally divided nature of Sephardic society in that period, especially with regard to questions of religious custom, political power, and social status. We need to bear in mind that for every poet and silk merchant, there were many Jews who plied more humble trades and left no mark on the religious or cultural landscape of medieval Judaism, not put here, but who did leave records in the archive of the Crown of Aragon in large numbers. These tanners, dyers, and shopkeepers and vintners, not to mention nearly all women, represent the majority of medieval Sephardic Jewry. So how do we understand Sephardic identity with regard to them? And I'll pause here also to mention that other than geography, we also haven't really talked much about, is there a way to gender Sephardic identity for this period? Moreover, the factional nature of Sephardic alhamas and the manner in which these factions related to one another militates against the development of a shared communal character, let alone one grounded in notions of collective cultural superiority. In closing, I just want to mention that some of the discussions in this symposium have really given me food for thought on this, but also on other issues, on medieval and early modern Jewish identities. I think we will all, no doubt, continue to engage in debates concerning the interplay of history and memory in the formation of Sephardic or Jewish identities, with acknowledgement that the Jewish life in medieval Spain pertains as much to the realm of memory as it does to anything else. My own contribution to this discussion has been to ask that some of the better-known assertions of collective memory not completely obscure some of the key features of actual social history. I have sought to provide a way of thinking about Sephardic social history that engages some of the salient tropes and markers of Sephardic identity while casting them in a new light. In so doing, I hope to encourage others to continue this endeavor in greater detail. By establishing a more nuanced and textured portrait of Iberian Jewry in the Middle Ages, we will no doubt have a better sense of how to evaluate Jewish societies of our own day. Thanks.
Yeah. Whenever you have where the map goes. Come on as well. And first, I thank you both for keeping to time and letting me cut you both off a little bit. But given that this is our last panel, we've got about 20 minutes left for discussion. And maybe I'll just kind of begin, but not so much asking a question, but maybe posing a dilemma of, how we deal with this question of identity that all of us are touching on, but that both of you are touching on as well. Matt's presentation in particular made me think about how we, where we draw the line, what actually constitutes an identity.
Right.
And identity is very self-reflective, the way that we're looking at it. Whereas I think, another way of defining it is who is yours and who isn't yours. The Russians say svai, which is somebody who is mine, is of my community. And if you ask somebody, is this person of your community, how they would respond. And when I think from maybe a 19th century European perspective, right? You ask a British lord who is theirs, and ask them if the townsman living on their estate or the peasant working in their land is one of their people, they're probably going to say no, even though this is somebody that they live their entire life with, that they see every day, that they share a language with, that they share a culture with, they go to church together with. But I think fundamentally they're going to say no. But then you ask them, is that Turkish prince who you don't share a language with, who you've never even met? But, are they one of yours? And they'll probably say yes. Or, that Russian nobleman who you are distantly related to somehow, but still, maybe half share a language through French, but, are you theirs? And they're going to say no. So how does, and what do we as historians say? Who is they? What are they? Are they a nobleman first, or are they a Brit first, or English first? How you define all these. So it's not really a question or anything, it's just a reflection that I think both of you touched on in interesting ways, in how how we, looking back through the perspective of 400 years, whatever, 500-600 years as historians, how we can ascribe these names to people. I know that gets to the heart of what we've been talking about, but I'll just open that up as a.
Or do you, is that a
maybe maybe it wasn't.
We'll have real questions.
Yeah, maybe it was just a way of talking while people are thinking of questions in their mind. So I'll take there you go. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to address Matt, and I'll do it briefly, but I do want to say a few things. I'm quite open to criticism of my paper. In fact, I welcome it, and I realize that I'm certainly not the last word on any of this, and that's why we come to conferences, to test our ideas. But I would say that if I'm being criticized, I would like to have it done without misrepresenting what I've said. And so there are a few things that I'll just say briefly to clarify. H.J. Simmels, a very important scholar, and he was a rabbi. He was a rabbinic scholar, and I in no way want to denigrate his work. But the statement that I quoted, he said that as a result of the Shulchan Aruch, Sephardim and Ashkenazim, quote, became united among themselves. And I think that is, at least from my perspective, and I'm certainly not alone, a problematic statement. In terms of, I certainly didn't say that Sfarad was only used as a place name. What I wanted to point out was that when it was used in the 16th century, that we shouldn't assume it's used the way we think about it, and that in many cases it is being used as a toponym, as a place, the name of a place. And then as for Spanish and Portuguese, the rabbi in my community talks about the S&P Jews, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and that is a term of self-identification that Portuguese Jews used, and one that I mentioned in my paper, but they didn't say Sephardim. They didn't use the term Sephardim. They spoke about Hebrews of Spanish and Portuguese nation. They were saying, yes, they also belong to the Nassau, but it was very situational. They used it only in circumstances in which they needed to be inclusive. And for the most part, when they said Nossa Nassau, that's not what they meant. So that just by way of clarification. Now, as to the importance of Nusach in Jewish identity formation, I by no means reject it, but I think you and I probably just wouldn't agree on its centrality. It's simply the way, with my training and thinking about identity and reading about identity, see things, postmodern or not, is the way I see things. And I think we just would not agree. But I do want to emphasize that this is not, I didn't mean to say something entirely new. I wanted to bring together insights from a lot of scholars who have spent far more time than I working on Mediterranean Jewry, including Jonathan and others in this room, who have exposed the problems in thinking of a Sephardic diaspora with any kind of social and cultural cohesion over the centuries.
Okay. Matt, you want to respond?
I apologize for taking the Simmels citation in the wrong way. I don't know what he could mean by Ashkenazim and Sephardim being united among themselves in anything more than, I don't know, a formal way. I think the way that people usually talk about it is and I had sort of assumed that this is what symbols meant, that if you are holding a Shulchan Aruch in your hand, you have the Sephardi Psak Halacha and you have the Ashkenazi Psak Halacha together in one book, and therefore both communities can see this book as their baseline halacha, and that brings them together in whatever sense, whatever limited sense that is. I can't imagine that he was saying, it makes them all one big community. So I took it in that sense. The Spanish and Portuguese Jews, yes, sure, right. They don't refer to themselves as Sephardim normally, and yet there is a huge amount of common ground, especially religiously in terms of practice, between them and Levantine Sephardim. And much less common ground between them and other Jewish communities. They don't like to admit it. They do see themselves as a nation, as their own group, and all the issues that you've written about and that others have written about, where they are willing to include people who are living as Catholics, who come from that background as part of their group, and not admit the Levantino or the Ashkenazi who's living next door. That sort of goes back to Jeffrey's sort of question about who is ours. They definitely would not normally regard Levantine Sephardim as being part of them, and yet there are so many markers that join them together. There are so many people moving back and forth between those communities. There are so many rabbis who are leading them in the religious sense, whatever that is, who are Levantine rabbis. So many, cultural and religious practices that even though they do not use the term Sephardim much, if at all, there is a lot that brings them together with Levantine Sephardim. That was kind of what I was trying to get at.
Let me just say one thing. I'm not sure that Chida would agree with you.
Right. So the Chida was probably not a good idea for me to mention because he's after 1750. I'm not going to be able to deal with that. I don't know what was falling apart at that time. And yet, right, the Chida represents a certain type of Sephardi intellectual of the Enlightenment period. He sees himself certainly as at least as culturally and intellectually sophisticated as these merchants and wild people that he finds in the Western Sephardi diaspora. He looks down on them, they look down on him, and yet he's going to them to collect money for the poor of the Holy Land. They seem to see each other as part of the same collective in the sense that they are trying, right, or that they have an interest in poor Sephardim in the Holy Land. And in fact, at least in earlier periods, and I think still in the time of the Chida, there are people from that community who are living in the land of Israel who need to be supported also. So I think the situation of the Chida is a little complicated. I can certainly see that there is a point, right? You are correct up to a point, but I think that it's more complex with him.
Let me see if Jonathan wants to weigh in on this point, or should I?
No.
Okay. More questions? Yes, Sarah. Yeah. Okay, Ross.
It strikes me throughout your talk, in spite of the references to the talk that wasn't, or that was but wasn't delivered, that you're asking, or you're expecting that a variety of kinds of evidence will all be able to do the same work. It struck me that you were expressing surprise, almost, and not surprise, but perhaps dismay, displeasure with the idea that the literary sources, the social historical sources, can't get us to the same place as the liturgical ones. So that's sort of one observation, and a second.
I'm sorry, can you just clarify that a little bit? I didn't quite understand, I think.
It struck me that you're asking evidence to do kinds of work that it cannot do.
And what kinds of work and what evidence? I mean, I'm sure you're correct. In fact, I'm really wondering about Jonathan's archival sources and why he thinks that they're going to tell us anything about Sephardic identity. So maybe this is exactly.
Well, I think to a certain extent, I'm echoing what Miriam said, that the liturgical sources are not necessarily going to get at questions of identity, and vice versa. The literary and social historical sources are not going to be able to, like, just aren't going to produce the same kinds of results as what you're looking for, and so to dismiss that the sort of the whole body of evidence as unsuitable for the purpose.
What is it I'm looking for from these sources?
Well,
I'm wondering what you're looking for. In other words,
I think I made it clear earlier what I was looking
well,
for.
let me be clear then. I have assumed that there is something of a Sephardic identity, a common Sephardic awareness of some kind, and people have sort of come forward with all kinds of arguments that doesn't exist, that it's a chimera, I'm.
Right. Well, so this is getting to sort of the second half of what I was trying to say.
Okay.
Which is that you started out by suggesting that the question of deconstructing that identity could be said of any identity group,
Mm-hmm.
and could be it's a claim that could be made, and it doesn't strike me that the broad applicability of a question isn't necessarily a reason to write it off, and so both of those things together, it struck me as a very kind of nihilistic intervention, and so I wonder what you're trying to achieve through that kind of nihilism in this.
Okay,
in this
I'm
context.
really amazed that I'm the nihilist here. In other words, I'm the one who's claiming that there is such a thing as Sephardi identity both before and after the expulsion, and the kind of common idea here, which Jonathan has just reasserted, is that no, there are so many factors that push these people apart and that separate them, and that communities, poor people don't see themselves, and so on. That seems to be the nihilistic argument. No, there is no group coherence here. What I'm not asking the evidence to do more, I think, than it actually does. What I'm asking is that if somebody comes along and says, no, these people didn't see themselves as a coherent group. Look, the leaders have a political interest or an economic interest in asserting their leadership, and so when they talk about Sephardi identity, you can sort of write it off. I'm the one who's asking.
So that's cultural historical evidence or economic historical evidence rather than liturgical evidence.
Well, my liturgical evidence was they used a similar liturgy. I'm asking the liturgical evidence to tell me that there is something in common about these people. They have a very similar liturgy, QED for me. That means there's something in common about them.
Maybe
That's
let
all I
me
ask.
just intervene here. I think I wish Deborah Dash-Moore was here, because this keywords in Jewish studies series that she's doing seems to be doing this type of deconstruction work on everything, right? So she has Cynthia Baker writing on Jew, arguing that really there's no such thing as a Jew; it's a construct, and Jeffrey Chandler says the same thing about Shtetl, and Noam Pianko says that about the Jewish people, and Daniel Boyarin about Judaism, and everything, each one, Haskalah, Olga Litvak says about Haskalah. So we're at this kind of point in time where I think we're trying to deconstruct, at least some people are trying
What
to
a beautiful
deconstruct all of these key terms in Jewish studies, and that may be kind of a part of what's going on here. But Ross.
So, I have some comments for Jonathan, but before I want to make a brief comment. Part of what's happened here this afternoon is, and I guess for the two, maybe for the three of you, our plenary speakers over the last 2 days, is the 12 or 13 of us have been here working on this, working through it, questioning one another, questioning evidence, what we can know, what we cannot know. We've been tying ourselves in knots about this every Wednesday and in the halls in between for an entire academic year. And you all did what people who wrap up conferences are supposed to do, which is to throw everything up for grabs again in a way, and you each did it very, very differently. And so you made a terrific contribution to our work. But on the other hand, you were handicapped in that you sort of came in at the end of a year-long conversation.
Like a bull in a china shop.
And so some of the reaction to what you thought you heard said or not you, but the three of you, in particular the two of you, you came in at the end of a conversation, and therefore, many of us have been still trying to work this out, and it was the question that Ryan posed in inviting the formation of the group, and that we were therefore obliged to try to answer in our own disciplines with the materials that we work with, and so on. And that's what we've been trying to do. Anyway.
Let me take rather than respond, let me take the other questions that are...
I don't get a question.
Oh, that wasn't your question?
That wasn't a question, that was my observation.
Okay, all right.
I'm sorry I'm long-winded, I'm old.
Okay, go ahead.
So I think what you did, Jonathan, was very helpful in the sense that you reminded us that those of us who deal more with the cultural historical materials, who are not social historians, can often lose sight of the limits of what it is that we're analyzing and talking about. I totally accept that. I do think you, in some instances, took it a bit too far in the sense that, you made some very helpful observations. I think, yes, we have no idea what Nasi meant for Chastai ben Shaprut, other than what the literary sources tell us. We do know that Samuel the Nagid had opponents within the Jewish community in Seville. All of that's really helpful because what it tells us is that this community, whatever we're going to call it, was like all other communities. There were rivalries, there were tensions, there were disputes. That's what human society is about. Our sources are limited. So here, for those of us who are dealing with primarily the cultural material and the cultural figures, I think you're a little bit unfair to the evidence. I don't know, for instance, that people didn't know in Sfarad who Yehuda Halevi was. What I do know is, first of all, he was involved in the ransom of captives, and therefore involved on a community level with other kinds of activities. I also know from the Geniza that, and again, I'm inferring, but there's a lot of evidence from the Geniza, when he arrived in Egypt, it was to a hero's welcome. Hero's welcome.
No
they
doubt.
knew who the guy was. They knew they had his poetry. They were singing his piyutim in synagogues, as we assume at some point people were doing in Sfarad as well. And so these figures, I'm not entirely comfortable saying that because we don't know about one, therefore we don't know about the others. Or that we have no way of estimating the impact on daily life for average people of the work that was done by the great figures that we know. Here's where I think Matt's intervention, and I differ a little bit with you here on this, I apologize. I think the consistency of transmission of piyutim and the copying of piyutim from the same Sephardi authors whose non-liturgical works we read and celebrate, I think there's something really significant there, and that evidence of the longevity of a tradition that clearly has an effect for the common folk attending synagogue is really, really powerful and long-lasting, and tells us something about, since it was written by the same poets using the same kind of inflected Andalusi biblical Hebrew in similar styles, recognizably so from particular authors. I think that there is and some of their religious ideas, the emphasis on the religious life of the individual in Andalusi Rishuyot, that then entered the Sephardi prayer book and its in its various permutations, means that religious thinking of the type that Ehud has been talking about did really filter down. I can't say that we know what the people who were reciting these Rishuyot made of it, how it affected them religiously, other than it seems to have been very popular because those Rishuyot, those piyutim, got transmitted through the ages and were used. And one final comment. I'm sorry, I know I'm really long-winded. I'm the worst of this entire bunch. I really apologize, but I can't help myself at this age. Ibn Danan and his father and his family. Ibn Danan made this thing called Seder Hadorot. His was a family that was going back and forth from Nasser, Granada to North Africa, probably Fez, absolutely Fez. And he tries to, and he is part of a rabbinic elite, but also a cultural elite, because he's interested in Andalusi poetics, and he's interested in Andalusi grammar. He wants to be the whole package again. And he is continuing the transmission of all of that package. And I think what we sometimes do is we want to kind of separate, the rabbinical authorities from the poets and the grammarians and so on. But during the Andalusi age, these were all the same people, with just a couple of exceptions. Anyway.
I just want to add to it, just on the same way to Jonathan. Has the late Howard Zinn lived enough to write the people's history of the Andalusian Jews in the 11th, 12th century, or the people's history of Italian Renaissance time of the 15th and 16th century? I think that the results were devastating as his book about the people's history of the United States. So, but the point here is that we are calling the golden age of the Andalusian, Jewish Andalusian period is because of their cultural achievement, just as we call the Renaissance in Italy.
Right.
Renaissance because of the cultural achievement, not because of the situation of the paddlers on that point.
Right.
Okay, we are over past closing time. Those 13 of us who are fellows will have the opportunity to continue these discussions over the next few weeks. So let me give the final word, though, to Jonathan, who hasn't had the opportunity to respond.
I will try to be brief, only because why not? Let's go eat. So yes, Ross. Yeah, I agree. I was trying to raise questions of, so we know this thing exists, what are the limits? What can we imagine the limits? And if we can't map it on the whole community, isn't that interesting? Where would it stop and why? What would stop it? So we don't know when he comes, by the way. We don't know if there was adoring crowds in Egypt. We hear there are adoring crowds in Egypt. Was it 100% attendance of all Jews living in Egypt? Was it 98%?
People are arguing about with whom he's going to celebrate Shabbat.
Right, okay. But I'm saying is, who's meeting him at the docks? You know what I'm saying? Even if that did happen, I'm wondering, is it 100%? And if it's not 100%, isn't that interesting? Are there women in the throngs?
These are all good questions.
Right, these are sort of what I said. I tried to say a couple times, what are the limits? And let's think about them. What would potentially, and this is where I think, I was trying to respond to a little bit what you were saying there. What would the things in the archives tell us about the way society is structured that could get us thinking about what kinds of limits could be put on identity? Not that the archives would say, by the way, in this custodial record of these people, they'll tell us that there's no Sephardi identity. I didn't think that was going to happen.
That would be nice.
That would be nice. It hasn't had. So,
More
you know,
effort.
is Halevi seen, and how is Halevi seen as our guy? I think that's a very nice way of putting it. He's our guy. In what way is he our guy? Is he a celebrity?
Yes.
Right. So is he more than a celebrity?
Yes.
Right. Is he a celebrity in every town? Do they know about him in Orense? If a guy comes down from Orense, I know you don't. By the way, raise your hand, except for Maya, who knows where Orense is. Okay. If you come down from Orense, and by the way, there are 4,000 little towns that no one ever talks about, and you come to the big city and you see throngs of people shouting that this guy should spend Shabbat with us, are you going to say, that must be Yehuda Halevi? Are you going to say, Yehu? Like what? And who is he to me even after I'm told who he is? These are some of the questions I think that are helpful reminders. Yes,
But
I can't help it.
What I'm saying is not all of us are social historians, so we're mindful of the questions you're asking.
Yeah.
But if you're, I'll take him, I'll leave myself out.
Yeah.
He studies Yehuda Levi and Baki ibn Pakuda as exemplary figures of this Sephardi culture during a particular period that had afterlives, that in Ashkenaz a lot, in both cases.
Yeah.
They're reading different books, but that's a separate question. But that's what he studies, and he studies it in the context of Islamic thought and practice at the time, and Jewish thought and practice at the time, and Jewish religious practice at the time. And he's mindful of the extent to which socio-historians can speak to this, but that doesn't turn him into needing to write social history.
Not at all, and nobody ever said so. Nobody ever said so. I'm just saying, when we're thinking this through, what are the limits of what we can know about these questions of identity?
That's a great sentence on which to end this. I know there are many of you signaling me desperately to speak, but I think we're well over time already.
Ryan wants to say something.
And Ryan wants to say something, so I will let Ryan say something. And on that note, I want to thank you all.
Wrap-up time? There was some kind of wrap-up.
There is a wrap-up.
Oh, is that what you're doing
It's
now?
just someone's question ate into the wrap-up time, Ross.
If you read the program, there's a little trick, which is that there's no end time. There's only the beginning of the closing remarks time, for which we're late. But it doesn't say when we're actually going to end. Now, in this debate, it's been a fair fight. And I'd like to just point out one piece of information that hasn't been considered in the final judgment. Now, we both go back to our corners. This is going to be a technical judgment. But I think in one case, we have to consider that you, Jonathan, are not just any social historian.
Uh-oh.
You are a social historian from Gaon University.
Yes, very
And
impressive.
so, I'm not exactly sure if
I may be the first Gaon at a Jesuit university. I have to check this, but I may be the first in quite some time.
So it's just important to consider that when we all vote on who's going to win.
I'm ready to back down.
Now, I'd like to begin ending by thanking everyone again, but sincerely thanking you all personally for being here, for participating in the year together, for humbling me and for indulging me with, really not humbling, honoring me and indulging me with this discussion that interests me, and having patience with me and my limitations in exploring these many questions that go far beyond my abilities, but not my interest. And especially to the invited guests for participating and being here and offering really sincere and deeply thought out ideas about how this conversation can be expanded and carried on. So it's personally just very meaningful to me to be able to thank you and to say that this has been a wonderful conversation. I think we're much further along than we were when we started. And I promised I wouldn't give definitive answers. And so we definitely have not given definitive answers. I think in that we can say this has been a great success. But we should also pause, since there wasn't, in all heavy discussions, there's also a sense of, well, now what? And I think the thing to end on is to remember that the point is the conversation, not the answer. And in this, and I don't mean to simply throw out history, Okay, so I'm not being postmodern in this. I'm being something else. I'm being avuncular in a way. And that is to say that ideas and critical discussions about ideas, it's like muscles. We have to use them, and otherwise they'll wither. And they'll wither into dogmas and to positions that are somehow personally maybe relevant but not useful in a general sense. And so it's important to put pressure on these ideas from all sides to keep them alive. So in the interest of not being dogmatic, but of keeping that conversation alive between social historians, between historians of ideas, between those of us interested in the Christian kingdoms, or those of us interested in linguistics, or those of us interested in philosophy and the duties of the heart. We have to remember that the answers are not bedrock. They're things that we find in our discussions with each other. And so the one thing that I think I'll end with, I had many remarks that I wrote and that I rewrote. I wrote yesterday, I wrote before we started, I rewrote again this afternoon, and I'm not going to say any of them. I will only say a sort of pleading, I guess is what it is, that we need to remember that we're doing work that is ethical, whatever we're doing. That to historicize, especially to historicize about the question of identity, especially to historicize about the question of identity in which people today still personally feel involved. We're doing work that is fundamentally ethical. And in that we need to be always aware of the stakes of our discussion, and in particular to understand the limits of our discourse. That is, we can talk about identity as a form of self-identification, the formation of communities from within, and how communities form their own histories and identities as, in a way, myths, but not only myths without real historiographical or historical foundation. But we can also talk about identity as imposed, as a social category, as something which was never accepted by the people who lived it. We all have these categories. They're put upon us, and we live through them. And we can find a way to negotiate these two as well. But in doing this, we have to remember the profound importance, the responsibility that we have as intellectuals to take both of those into account. We're not only talking about facts, we're not only talking about those categories as seen from without, but we're also not only talking about those categories as lived from within. And so there has to be a negotiation between those two very, very different worlds, at least when we're talking about things like identity. And so the ultimate thing has to be, I think, to do, and here I'm going to invoke what might sound a little perverse, because it's especially in this context, but I'd like to invoke a sort of Augustinian model as my final recommendation, that is to read the law lawfully, as he would say. Now, we can throw out everything he means by that and use it in our own way, which maybe isn't lawful in his terms. But what I mean by that is to always read in good faith. Whatever we're doing, we're not trying to pervert what is at stake on both sides of this discussion. And so ultimately, that's my form of ending, is to plead with us all to remember that that is what we're doing. We are essentially making the law. But when we do that, we have the responsibility to take both sides into account. And so again, thank you for being here, and I hope we can continue this conversation. I'm sure we will. So now we go to dinner. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.